Our team here at UVM has been working on trying to collect some initial information on farms that are utilizing alternative milking strategies. And so today we'll be presenting some of our findings to you. I just want to kind of reiterate, it's just the beginning. This is, I want to say necessarily preliminary data, but it is in a lot of ways because it's the first time we've actually really started to dig into this and try to gain some more information on farms in our region that are implementing some of these strategies. So again, if you're just joining us, welcome. Our speakers today will be Sara Ziegler from right here from UVM Extension, our Northwest Crops and Soils team, and Sara Flack from Flack Consulting. I'm sure most of you are familiar with both of those names, have been out in the dairy and organic dairy world, assisting farmers on a wider range of topics, and now diving into this topic a little bit more. I just want to also thank the USDA SARE program for funding this research and outreach to, again, hopefully answer some of the questions that you have. And I think with that, Sara Ziegler, you're kicking us off.
Yes, I am.
All right.
Great. Thanks, Heather, and thanks everybody for joining us today. I'm going to jump through the first couple of slides quickly because Heather kind of gave you the overview. But as Heather mentioned, we have been looking at these alternative, what we're calling alternative milking strategies, which again is basically anything but the usual year-round, twice-a-day milking. So that might be seasonal milk production where all the cows in the herd are dry simultaneously. So a couple of months where no milk is being produced. And then there's other milking frequencies less than twice a day. So that might be once a day or these, 3 times in 2 days or 10 times a week or some other frequency along those lines. And we also looked at a little bit about robotic milking systems as well, although they're not all that common in the Northeast region. And as Heather mentioned, this project was funded by a Northeast Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education, or Northeast SARE project. And really this project had sort of 2 components. One was a survey that maybe many of you answered. Thank you if you participated. And the goal of the survey was really to try to understand how prevalent these strategies were in the Northeast. We had been getting a lot more questions and interest in them, but weren't really sure how prevalent they were, how prevalent that interest really was, or if it was just something that we were starting to see a little bit more of. And also what some of the main challenges were in adopting those strategies and what some of the benefits and impacts that occurred from adopting or trying those strategies. And there has been some information on these types of strategies coming out of places like New Zealand, and those have been very helpful, but it's always nice to have some information generated from our region that's specific to our production systems, so that we have better information to help farmers make the decisions around whether these strategies are viable or not. And as you can imagine, a lot of the questions that farmers have surround the economics of these systems. And so the other part of the project that Sara Flack has been managing is really trying to understand the cost of production on farms utilizing these alternative strategies and how those strategies sort of may change costs and the overall cost of production and whether or not they seem like they are economically viable opportunities for farms in this region or not. So I'm going to talk about the survey first, and then I'll turn it over to Sara to talk about the cost of production. And so we sent surveys out mostly to organic dairy producers in the Northeast. Again, that was mostly because it seems like an opportunity that was coming out of the organic and grass-fed industries and not so much in the conventional world, where that's probably not an opportunity for those farms. So out of the 800 surveys that we sent across the Northeast, which was New England, New York, and Pennsylvania, we got 134 responses. So kind of a low response rate, but although not all that uncommon for surveys. And one thing interesting to note while we look at these results was that 62% of the respondents self-identified as belonging to the plain community. And this is very similar to what we saw when we did a national survey of 100% grass-fed dairy as well. And you can see in this little cow visual here, the breakdown of whether they were certified organic or managing organically, but not certified grass-fed. And we did have a few conventional producers that found the survey and answered it as well. So again, most of the respondents, about 64%, were certified organic producers, 34% were certified grass-fed, and then there were some that were not certified to either one of those production systems. So of all of those respondents, only 17% indicated that they had tried or were currently using one of those alternative strategies. So really not all that common out in the region. And when we looked at what types of strategies folks were using, the most prevalent was once-a-day milking. And then you can also see there was some seasonal production and the other milking frequencies that we had talked about. And some folks were utilizing more than one strategy, so they might be seasonal, but also milking once a day. And then interestingly, when we looked at the farms using these alternative strategies, although we saw in the overall respondents more farms that self-identified as belonging to the plain community responding, a higher proportion of the English farms actually were using those alternative strategies. So lots of the plain community farms that answered actually were not interested in using those strategies. And we also saw a higher percentage coming from the grass-fed industry. And this is kind of along the lines of what we were thinking was going on, that there was an opportunity for the grass-fed farms to be utilizing these strategies, since they typically already have lower milk production and some other management challenges. Okay, so what was different on the alternative strategy farms? In this table at the bottom, you can see we're just lumping all of the alternative strategy farms, so that's seasonal, all the different milking frequencies, all together, and comparing it to the year-round twice-a-day respondents. And so we saw lower milk production as we expected. The average was 24% lower production compared to the year-round twice-a-day farms. We also saw some differences in the breeds of cows that farms were using. So the alternative strategy farms were using a higher proportion of crossbreeds and Jerseys as opposed to Holsteins. Again, aligns with the lower milk production that we saw and some of the other characteristics they may be selecting for. And then we also saw a slight difference in herd size, where the alternative farms may be managing a few more extra cows to compensate for slightly lower production. The other thing you'll see on these tables is that we asked about how long people were using these strategies for. So we're showing the range in the duration in months and then the median, so you can get an idea of the sort of range that like you can see in the year-round twice a day. Somebody responded that they had been milking cows for 70 years, and the average or the median was 17 years. But so when you look at the alternative strategy farms, there's somebody who has responded to this survey who had been using one of those strategies for 23 years, but really the median was 24 and a half months. So again, some of this is related to the fact that we were asking farms who may not be utilizing these strategies anymore, but had tried them for a short period of time. So they maybe tried for a few months to milk once a day and then decided not to do it anymore. So just one note about how to sort of interpret these results. So then if we go further and break down that group of alternative farms into these different actual strategies, like once a day milking, the 3 times in 2 days milking, or seasonal production, how did they compare to one another? So in the overall, if you look at the milk production, the once a day had a lower milk production than all the other alternative strategies. But overall, if we go back a slide, you can see that year-round twice a day at about 13,500 pounds per cow per year. So all of the alternative strategies that we saw had lower milk production than that. Again, to be expected. And so if we looked at the comparison from the year-round twice a day to each of those alternative strategies, it was about a 14% reduction in milk production for the farms milking 3 times in 2 days, and a 27% reduction for the farms milking once a day. We also, again, saw slight differences in herd composition. You can see on the far right of that table, the seasonal farms were more heavily using crossbred animals, but again, still mostly using crossbreeds and jerseys compared to more Holsteins in the year-round twice a day. And then if we look at the durations of times that farms had been using these strategies, really what this is showing us is that there are some farms that have been doing these strategies for a very long time, but in the grand scheme of things, most people had been doing them for a pretty short amount of time, and especially the 3 and 2 milking is very new to this region and does not have many people who have yet adopted it. So we also asked farms about the impacts that they saw when they adopted these alternative strategies. And so this sort of upside down pyramid is showing the most common responses that farms indicated they saw impacts in. So you can see at the top, the decrease in milk production. About 70% of farms said they saw a decrease in milk production. And we also tried to ask people to estimate the sort of severity of the impact. And so for milk production, the average response was a 25% reduction in milk production. And again, this is just all alternative strategy farms together. There was also some milk quality issues that people indicated. They saw increased somatic cell count, and this really ranged from a 14% increase to a 277% increase. So a big challenge on farms, and maybe indicating that some of the herds who tried to adopt these strategies were better positioned to actually be successful at them. You can see in the pyramid, there's a few other impacts that came up: increased reproductive performance, increased cull rate, and also increased body condition. So when we asked about the main challenges facing each of these groups of farms, the farms that indicated they were using once-a-day milking strategy really struggled with maintaining milk quality and maintaining somatic cell counts at an acceptable level. Whereas the 3 and 2 milking herds really just struggled maintaining that milking schedule, milking sort of at odd ends of the day and one day, and then in the middle of the day, the next day, and just sort of that schedule being challenging for themselves or other farm labor. And then the seasonal producers obviously have a huge pressure to get all of the cows bred in a pretty narrow window to maintain that production system. And then across the board, all of the farms pretty much indicated that they were very concerned about the economics of those systems if they had not tried to adopt them, or were hesitant to say that it was going to work on their farm. They were really uncertain about the reduction in milk production that they may experience and the economic impact of that. Also the impact on milk quality and sort of the economic impact of that. And then also the additional costs associated with transitioning the herd to that system. So they may have extra costs associated with raising more animals, more replacements to sort of, weed out the ones that don't fit that system over time, and don't end up generating enough return. So with that, I think I'm going to pass that on to Sara now, who's going to talk a little bit more about the economics.
Great. Thank you, Sara. And there have been just a few questions coming in as we went. And so I just want to circle back and make sure, especially folks who hopped in a little bit late, know that the 3 different alternative milking schedule strategies that we looked at with both the survey and with the cost of production data was looking at farms that were milking seasonally. So that's when all of the cows are dried off at the same period of time, generally for about 2 months. There's no milking on the farm. And then all of the cows need to calve in a specific calving window. So they all need to breed back in that calving window and calve in that specific calving window. And then the other 2 groups are farms that were milking once a day instead of twice a day. And then the less common group that some of you were asking me about are milking 3 times every 2 days instead of 4 times every 2 days. And that's usually with a staggered schedule. So they're milking twice on one day and once on another day. But the schedule is a little, it's different times each day so that they're on a set number of hours between milkings. Hopefully I cleared that, explained that clearly enough. So Sara Ziegler has been talking about the data that came in from the survey that was from over 100 farms. I'm now going to share some of the information that we got through the cost of production portion of this study, which is with a much smaller sample size of groups. And so this is farms data from 2019 and 2020. And this is data collected using Dairy Trans, which we like because it standardizes the cost of production across farms, whether they have a lot of debt or a small amount of debt. It allows us to look at farms on a level playing field. The focus here is on the cost of production, not so much on profit, and also trying to look at some of the differences in management from farm to farm. Very small sample size here, and so that's going to limit some of the conclusions that we can make here, but still gives us some useful information to look at and learn more from. We had an average of 10 farms participating each of the 2 years, and there were 12 unique farms over the 2 years. So some of the farms participated both years, some only participated in 1 year. The farms were in the Northeast region, specifically located in New Hampshire, New York, Pennsylvania, and Vermont. And it is interesting to look at the range of the data within these farms, not just the averages. So we'll be looking a little at both, but the average herd size on the farms using these alternative strategies was 69 cows. But then within that, the range was 37 to 220 cows. You can do the next slide, Sara. So all of the farms in this cost of production group were both certified grass-fed and certified organic. The grass-fed certification standards are an add-on to the organic certification standards. And this group includes farms that are milking seasonally, milking once a day, and milking 3 times every 2 days. So because of the small sample size, we had to smush all 3 of those categories together into one group of farms. We didn't have enough farms to break the data out separately. So the grass-fed certification, just go back to that slide a tad, and I'll just go through. For folks who are not familiar with the grass-fed certification standards for the dairy farms, because these were all commercial dairies shipping to either Organic Valley or Maple Hill Creamery. And so they were required not to feed any grain to any of the animals, including the young stock on the farm. There's also a higher dry matter intake requirement from pasture during the grazing season. These grass-fed farms need to hit a minimum of 60% intake from pasture compared to organic ones that only have to hit 30%. And then the grazing season also needs to be longer for these grass-fed certified farms, needs to be a minimum of 150-day grazing season compared to just 120 days for the organic ones. All right, next slide. So jumping into looking at some of the data side by side, you can see on the left-hand column, those are the farms using the alternative strategies, just looking at the average. So there's 19 farms included in that, and it's the 2019 and 2020 data. And then we're comparing that to farms that were milking year-round 2 times a day. So you can see at the top, the herd size on the farms using these alternative milking schedules is larger at 69 cows compared to 59. Possibly, we didn't collect this information, but it could be that they increased their herd size to compensate for the lower milk production per cow. Butterfat content was a little bit higher on the farms using these alternative strategies at 4.6% compared to 4.1%. And then skipping down a little bit to milk sold per cow per year is 8,038 on the farms using the alternative strategies. and 9,083 on the farms milking year round. So you can see it's a little bit lower in terms of the pounds of milk being shipped per cow on the farms using alternative schedules. I want to just quickly reflect back to the data that Sara Ziegler was presenting from the survey. Those numbers in terms of milk production in the survey are self-reported milk production, which is different than the pounds of milk the farm actually ships. And so this is certainly lower than their self-reported pounds of milk that they are that they're actually producing. We can talk about that in a little while too. So then when the next number down, we're looking at the actual hundredweights sold off the farm. Again, it's a little different because there's more cows on these farms with using the alternative strategies. So even though milk is lower per cow being sold, they're selling more hundredweights, 5,491 hundredweights sold off the farms per year using the alternative strategies, which is just a little bit higher than the 5,331 hundredweights being sold off the farms who are milking year round and milking twice a day. Skipping down to look at some of the other information on this slide. Acreage is pretty similar per farm and per mature cow on these farms, 5.5 to 5.6 acres per mature cow. We do that calculation based on the number of mature cows, not paying attention to the number of young stock on that farm. So some of them might have been raising more or less heifers that wouldn't be captured in that number, but a similar acreage per cow. So then looking at the costs down at the very bottom of this slide, total cost per farm, pretty similar between the two different groups, 289,000 versus 296,000 in total cost per farm per year. There are more cows on the alternative strategy farms, and so the cost per cow is a little bit lower on those farms. Then the cost per hundredweight is also ever so slightly smaller on the farms using the alternative strategies. But I just want to remind everybody, this is a very small sample size of just an average of 10 farms per year participating in this. And so looking at these numbers, I would say they're pretty much the same between these two groups. Next slide. So I wanted to look a little bit more at milk production and then also talk a little bit about how Dairy Trans looks at milk production to standardize things further from farm to farm. So again, here, the first number is milk produced and sold. So it's the milk sold per cow per year. And then the next one down, 5,491 versus 5,331, that's the hundredweights sold per farm per year. In Dairy Trans, the cost per hundredweight is calculated per hundredweight equivalent so that it factors in the non-milk but dairy-related income in there. So it takes the total hundredweights of milk sold, and to that it adds things like income from calves, income from sale of hay, and milk-related ag program payments. It did not include COVID payments or one-time payments like that. So that means that the hundredweights equivalent is somewhat higher than the actual hundredweights sold off the farm. Next slide. So just looking a little bit more at how Dairy Trans does this calculation per hundredweight. Again, the reason we really like Dairy Trans is it allows us to create a level playing field to compare farms to each other that might have very different levels of debt load and may also be taking very different owner draw or family living expense draw from their farms. So starting at the top here, you can see that's the total milk sold in hundredweight equivalents that the cost per hundredweight equivalent gets calculated over. The next section looks at the cash expenses. And in Dairy Trans, interest is not included in the cash expenses. We'll talk about how that gets factored in a little bit later. So you can see the total cash expense per farm is a little bit higher on the farms using alternative milking strategies. It's also a little bit higher per hundredweight. Then there are also some balance sheet adjustments that get done. And this includes changes, income change, expense change, and also capital purchases minus capital sales. So to put that in simpler language, we're looking at a beginning and an ending balance sheet and making sure that we're factoring in any decrease in farm equity and assets or significant increase in farm assets or equity. Then this next, the 4% equity charge, it is what is charged on the fair market value of all of the assets on the farm, and that is done instead of including the actual interest expense on the farm. So this standardizes an equity charge instead of having some farms have a lot of interest and others have none, depending on whether they have a lot of debt or no debt. Then the next that gets factored in is the unpaid labor cost. And this is done instead of having the farmers include what they actually pay themselves, or if they're actually not paying themselves. There's a very large range in what the farmers draw for their own living expenses. And so what Dairy Trans does is it takes the actual number of hours that the owner operator works each year, and then it assigns an income per full-time equivalent of $40,000. And so that's where we see that next line, the unpaid labor cost is factored in. So all of this gets added together to give us our total cost per farm, which looks very similar between these two groups, both on a per farm basis and on a per hundredweight basis. $289,000 per alternative farm, $289,000 compared to $296,000 on the year-round twice-a-day milking group. And also pretty similar cost of production on a per hundredweight equivalent basis. There's a question that I'll answer right now, which is there more information about replacement rates between the once-a-day and the 2 times a day farms? We don't have that information. We'll talk about that in a little while. That's on the list of things that I would also love to know a little bit more about for these farms. So next, I'm going to look a little bit more at the details on some of the cash expenses. So again, the cash expense per hundredweight equivalent was $26.60 on the farms using alternative strategies and $25.31 on farms milking year-round and milking twice a day. So pretty similar. Just a reminder here on the herd size, milk sold per cow, hundredweights and hundredweight equivalents sold in the top 4 numbers there. And then looking at the cash expenses per hundredweight, pretty similar to each other. Per cow, they are a little bit lower per cow. There's more cows on the farms using alternative strategies, and it's a little bit higher on a per farm basis on the farms using alternative strategies at 174,000 compared to 149,000. Skip to the next slide. So now looking at what were some of the costs that were higher in these two groups. For the farms using the alternative strategies, their costs were higher in custom hire, purchased supplemental energy sources, which since these are all 100% grass-fed, certified grass-fed farms, it's pretty much only molasses since grain's not allowed. Repair costs were higher, seed and fertilizer costs were higher, purchased forage costs were higher, and supplies were higher. For the farms milking year-round and milking twice a day, hired labor and land rental were higher. Next slide. So sometime in the next week, we will have a report summarizing all of this available on the website that will include this graph. So don't try to memorize this now. But this is just a bar graph showing the cash expenses on the year-round farms in the orange bars and in the alternative strategy farms in the blue bars. And just looking at a few of these that I think are particularly interesting. I think it's the 5th one down, hired labor. You can see that the year-round farms in orange, definitely a higher expense there. But then if you pop down to the next one under it on custom hire, you can see that the alternative strategy farms are spending more on custom hire, while the year-round farms are spending more on hired labor. Next slide. So looking again at some of the labor efficiency information, the farms that were using alternative milking schedule strategies spent only 6.4% of their total cash expenses on hired labor, whereas farms milking year-round, milking twice a day, it was 9.3% of their total cash expenses. So looking at some of the information that we do have in this data set, and again, this is a small data set, an average of 10 per year, but enough differences here that I think are pretty interesting to look at. Full-time equivalents, so this is the total labor force on the farm, including the paid labor and the unpaid labor. And this is actually calculating how many hours they're working and then dividing it by 3,000 hours, which is considered one full-time worker. Even though I realize those of you who are dairy farmers on this webinar work more than 3,000 hours a year, that's the standard that gets used in here in Dairy Trans. So fewer full-time equivalents working on the farms with alternative strategies, 1.94 versus 2.71. And that combined with the fact that there are more cows on these alternative strategy farms mean that there's more cows per full-time workers. So that's a measure of improved labor efficiency on these farms. They're also shipping more milk per full-time worker. And then paid labor, you can see 12,000 on the alternative farms and 15,000 on the year-round farms. Paid labor per cow is also lower on the alternative farms. Paid labor per hundredweight is also lower. And then the next line is an interesting one. This is unpaid labor. So this is the number of hours that the owner manager is working each year. And you can see that's also lower on these alternative strategy farms. And then we put the bottom number in here to then also just look at the fact that these alternative strategy farms are also using more custom hire. We don't have information to be able to say, was this custom manure spreading or custom haying? So there's more information to dig out there, but those farms were certainly paying more for custom hire. Next one. So wrapping things up, these alternative milking strategies, again, we lump them all in here together. This involves farms, includes farms that are milking once a day, farms that are milking 3 times every 2 days, and farms that are milking seasonally. And these strategies may indeed be worth considering for some farms, especially if they are grass-fed farms and they've been able to do some sort of self-assessment on their farm to make sure there's not going to be a negative and economic impact from making less milk and some of the other impacts that farmers report from these alternative strategies. But farmers certainly are stating that they are using these management systems to improve quality of life and to have more family time. And so quite a lot of the benefits aren't necessarily about economics and can be more challenging to evaluate. Next slide. So this is now leaving our cost of production data set aside for a minute and looking back at the survey data that Sara Ziegler was presenting at the beginning of the webinar, looking at the larger group of farms who responded to that survey. This is over 100 farms now. These are some of the benefits that they discussed in the survey respondents to having these alternative milking schedule strategies on their farm. 75% of them said they liked the increased flexibility of daily task timing. 49% talked about the ability to participate in off-farm income generating ventures. So finding other ways to bring some income into the farm or to the family. 32% said they had decreased facilities and equipment wear and tear as a benefit they were thinking about. And 18% said decreased feed or pasture demand. And there were some farms certainly say that they feel like they're taking some of the production pressure off their cows. And And then there is also other at the very top, 17%. Anything else to add to this slide, Sarah, before we go on to the next two?
Would just say it really aligned with what you were just sharing, that in the things that were sort of fell into that other category really referred to things about increasing quality of life, whether that was having more family or time for vacation and time away from the farm, sort of taking care of farmer physical and mental health. And then also this just the reduced labor demand and labor costs, which we clearly saw in the cost of production data as well. So definitely some economic, but some other non-economic benefits as well.
Next slide. So the next two slides will just wrap stuff up by talking about what we don't know and what we would like to know more about, because again, this was a pretty small sample size in the cost of production data. And so we would really like to know more about when is the labor savings benefit of these alternative milking schedules worth the lower milk production per cow. And then because we did see that on average farms that were using these strategies had higher herd sizes, we're also wondering, are farms with smaller herds or herd size that's limited by either facilities or land base, so they can't increase the number of cows? Will these alternative milking strategies still be able to work financially for farms in that sort of a situation? Next slide. So this is getting to some of the questions I'm seeing come in the chat, actually, which is what information can we go find now on the difference between the amount of milk being produced per cow and the amount of milk being sold? So getting to some of these questions coming in on how many replacements are these farms raising? And do some of these different milking schedule strategies result in a different replacement rate needed? For example, on a seasonal farm where the selection criteria needs to be getting your cows to hit a specific calving window and get bred at a specific time, they're having to make culling decision based on reproduction. Is that resulting in a consistently higher cull rate and replacement rate on those farms? In addition, then is more milk being discarded to maintain a low somatic cell count on farms doing once a day milking so that they can continue to get the milk quality premiums that are pretty high on these certified organic farms and certified grass-fed farms? So how much milk are those calves really drinking? How much milk is getting discarded? Because we do see a big difference between the self-reported survey data of how much milk they're making and the amount that they are actually shipping when we look at the cost of production data. And then the final question that we're left with is the same question we were left with when we looked at the larger 100% grass-fed cost of production data set, which is when is these are the energy supplementation with things like molasses truly cost effective for these certified grass-fed farms that can't feed grain? And I think that brings us to the last slide, which is just connecting with some of the resources that are available on the website. And there's the information that Sara Ziegler was presenting on the survey results is the first link that you see there. We've got a grass-fed dairy production course starting in January that farmers can sign up for, and service providers also. That's a four-part series of classes starting in January. And then there's additional information on our grass-fed dairy research project. A lot of the project reports are on the website also in that third link. I think that leaves us with time for questions. Yeah, I was just about to reply to the one on what the milk market was for these farms. And for the cost of production portion of this project, all of the farms included were commercial dairies that were shipping to either Organic Valley or to Maple Hill Creamery. We didn't include any value added or on-farm processors or direct marketers because they tend to have a higher cost of production. And I don't know if we collected that information in the survey, Sarah.
The surveys were mainly distributed through the milk buyers. So Organic Valley and Maple Hill Creamery were very helpful in sending that out, as well as just through our main dairy lists. So we didn't specifically ask, but just by the way that we distributed it, I'm pretty sure most of them were shipping to those companies as well.
So Larry asked a question about different milking systems, efficient parlors versus stalls, a tie stall barn within each group. And I don't think we analyzed that specifically for this small subset of the alternative milking schedule farms, but we did for the larger set of all of the 100% grass-fed farms, and over 60% of them is my recollection as to how many of them had already converted from tie stalls to parlors or had set up new farms with parlors. So a relatively high number of farms with parlors in this. We don't have information on who's got a high speed, more efficient parlor versus an older parlor though. All good questions. We should add that to our list of questions.
There's another question, Sarah, on is there a standard cost of production to compare these numbers to?
Well, the comparison that we did in here was just comparing, because these were all grass-fed farms, we compared the grass-fed farms using the alternative strategies to the grass-fed farms who were milking twice a day year-round. We didn't take the time to compare it to either regular organic, which generally has a lower cost of production, or to conventional, which is an even lower cost of production.
We've included the link to the grass-fed dairy production course that will start January 20th. And that goes for 4 weeks, and it's an online course. But we do have the ability to also host folks that do not have internet. So you will be able to call in, and we are planning to mail out the course materials to folks that can't access the online program. And Sarah, there's a question about, was there any difference in the energy used or purchased energy? I think you talked about that.
Yeah, purchased energy was within the small cost of production data set that averaged 10 farms a year. The expense, the cash expense was higher for purchased energy, which is pretty much entirely molasses for these farms within the farms using the alternative milking systems strategies. And I'll be honest, I don't know what that means. It's a pretty small data set. And for some reason, those farms were spending more buying molasses. We had a similar question coming out with the overall cost of production for all of the grass-fed farms combined together. Is, really asking this question of when are energy supplements, when is buying molasses really a cost-effective strategy for a grass-fed farm?
Sarah, it looks like Carol what meant power, like utilities, not.
Oh, I immediately thought energy.
Yeah, me too. That's exactly what I thought.
Yeah. Let me look on my slide real quick, see which Sarah can get to it quicker. Well,
Sarah Z, I have a different question for you. Did our survey ask the farms how, if they plan to continue using these strategies? I know we asked them how long, but did we ask them if they were planning to continue? I don't think we did. But.
No, we didn't ask that. And that is, I think, one of the interesting things that would be great to have a little bit more detail on for folks who maybe tried for a few months and then found it not viable for some reason, versus how many of these farms actually had been and continued to use these strategies. This survey was a pretty short survey and just gave us a kind of a quick snapshot of what folks are kind of currently doing or interested in, but there's definitely more work to be done there.
So I actually think the question that Carol Delaney asked is really an interesting one that we have not dug into. So you can see utility cost down there towards the bottom. The year-round farms in orange were spending more on utilities. Utilities in dairy trans does include more than just electricity, but it does appear that those farms did have a higher utility bills. So.
So maybe alternative strategies have less of a carbon footprint. That was Carol's response. So
yeah,
yet another question.
We'll add that to the list of things that we'd like to know more about.
Yeah. Ben was asking about correlations in the cost of production, which I don't believe we did, but the length of alternative practice, so how long somebody had been implementing once a day or seasonal versus, their cost of production. So if they had been doing it longer, was the cost of production lower?
We did not have a big enough sample size with just an average of 10 farms per year to feel comfortable running correlations on this. So we don't have that information. But that's definitely on the list of things I would be curious to know more about. I think one of our challenges is that there's a relatively small number of farms using these strategies. And so I'm not sure we're going to be able to get a larger sample size if we do this analysis again, just given how many farms have tried it, only done it for a little while, and some who have not continued to do it. And the other thing, just to remind people, is because of the small sample size, we also had to lump together the farms that were milking just once a day with the farms that were seasonal, and then the smaller number of farms that were trying the newer milking 3 times every 2 days.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, because there could be some pretty significant differences between those models as well. So Larry, thanks for chiming in. He was just chiming in saying gas, fuel, and oil are all considered part of energy in dairy trans. And let's see, I think there was one other question from Jason. He was saying for smaller herds, I know viability is still an open question, but are there any thoughts before data arrives? Also, any data on robots?
There were a few farms with robots that responded to the larger survey, but we didn't include any farms with robots in the cost of production study, since those were there were less of them, and we don't have any farms that have robots that are also grass-fed. All of the robot farms are feeding some grain. So yeah, I don't have information from this project on that.
Great. I think we have answered all the questions up in the and custom hire. So thanks, Larry. If people didn't figure it out, Larry is dairy trans. So thank you, Larry.
Thank you so much, Larry. And that Larry does just make a really good point, which is since the farms using the alternative systems did have higher custom hire costs, they might have lower fuel costs. And so that would be wrapped into that utility bill on the bar graph. And so, maybe they do have, a lower utility bill, but they're paying somebody else to make their feed or spread their manure for them. So it's hard to know. We don't have enough information. Again, we don't have enough information to have clarity on that.
Yeah, and I think, as what has been mentioned many times throughout the webinar today, we wanted to gain more information on these production systems, and that's what we set out to do. We have a little more information than we started with, but know that we're just scratching the surface here, and hoping that we can continue investigating, as clearly there's interest in knowing more, and we're interested as well. I think we have time for another question. Let's see here. Sorry if I missed it earlier, But was there data on replacement rates in the once a day milking? So I would.
There was not,
Okay.
but we would love to know.
Oh, great. You already answered that. Okay. Well, next project. And Leon just said thank you. These 1-hour webinars are a really good way to get information. So we definitely appreciate everybody's time today. And we will be offering more outreach events this winter. Like we already mentioned, we have the grass-fed dairy production course starting, which will dig into some of these topics a bit more. We also are planning to host the Organic Dairy Conference again this year, but in person at VTC on March 9th. We haven't posted the agenda or program yet, but we'll be doing so shortly after the new year. So I don't see any additional questions. So we're done.